Okay, and we are live.
This is Bishop Enoch.
This is Deacon Joseph Swaden. We are doing the last episode of Orthodox Apologetics Live. The last regular episode, I should say, because we occasionally will find a reason to do another episode, probably until after the end of the Nativity season. And basically, probably after, I'm guessing after Theophany is when we could go back to regular shows. But until then, this is our last regular broadcast. Something, comes up that's big, we will definitely cover it. Today's an interesting show, though, because Vladika, you found this book, and I'm curious as to how or when. Because should I include a link to it?
Sure.
Yeah. The book is called The Pope and the Council. It was a book written 150 years ago, on the eve of the Vatican Council, the year before Vatican I, with, let me just send a link. I don't think Pope Boniface X will be joining us. But in any case, at the end, it was held, the book was written a year before the First Vatican Council came out, with a lot of predictions of what it would take, what it would do, and a lot of the time it's right. So there's a lot of, it is a Roman, can you give a little background how you found it and who wrote this and stuff, Vladika?
I generally search Google Books every now and again for keywords about Ultramontanism, books about Ultramontanism, things like that, and that's kind of how I found it, I think, last week. The book, as I understand, was written by a group of Belgian Roman Catholics in the 1860s, I think.
Yes, 1869, 150 years to now.
And I should note, like you said, they are Roman Catholics, and they do kind of have a liberal political attitude, and I don't agree with that. But they are good at pointing out that the Ultramontane arguments are basically fallacious. And they go into pre-schism history, and then they also cover a lot of Roman Catholic history, disputation against papal supremacy and such.
And this is also useful because at times when you're arguing, it's good to argue from the fathers, which is why I do suggest that. But I'll tell you, it is a little bit short when it's dealing with the fathers. It just says basically these fathers don't even mention papal papal power or anything like that, papal jurisdiction or its extension. The book is useful in terms of looking at Roman Catholicism's own, I hate to say it, heretical history in creating this doctrine of papal infallibility that even a year before the council, thousands, if not millions, of Roman Catholics probably didn't approve of. So that's something. It's something worth noting because you can read the dark details of how this occurred. Basically, like what's a good example of Vladika? You mentioned what they did with Pope Vigilius. We talk about him a lot on the show. So.
Well, I believe on page 277. They talk about how a 13th century Roman Catholic papal court historian essentially rewrote the history of Pope Vigilius and the Fifth Ecumenical Council. The real history is that Pope Vigilius did not want to hold a Fifth Ecumenical Council. He, in fact, was against it explicitly. However, the bishops gathered in Constantinople for the council at the request of the Emperor Justinian and the Patriarch, and a summons was sent to Pope Vigilius. He refused to come. So the Emperor St. Justinian sent the magistrates from Constantinople. They arrested Pope Vigilius, and they brought him against his will to Constantinople, where he was placed under house arrest. I mean, he had a palace and things, so he wasn't being tortured or anything, but he was not there at his own bidding. And he refused, I think, to attend some sessions on several occasions. And at one point, because of his intransigence, the council fathers said that they would excommunicate him. I think they actually did. There's some argument. They actually had removed him from the diptychs for a short period of time. And then eventually Pope Vigilius caved in on the question of the three chapters. And that was kind of how, anyway. But the court historians of the papacy in the 13th century at Rome rewrote it to the point where it was Pope Vigilius who was president of the council and who presided in quote-unquote sovereign majesty in Constantinople. And the emperor did whatever the Pope Vigilius said, and the council did whatever he said. So they kind of rewrote the history so the exact opposite happened as to what actually happened. Because frankly, they could not admit the fact that Vigilius was being dictated to by the council.
Yeah, it's really kind of sad. The way it's phrased is, it may suffice for an illustration of his treatment of ancient church history to say that he describes Pope Vigilius as holding the Fifth Ecumenical Council at Constantinople in sovereign majesty, with the hearty cooperation of the Emperor Justinian, who manifested an entire devotion to him. So was history written at the papal court. Basically, this is actually one of those things that you kind of have to, especially when you're dealing with, papal apologists, is you kind of have to hammer the history down. You have to know it, because a lot of the time they're reading a romanced version of it. And it's, a romanticized version of it, I should say. And it's not real. So the fact that even Roman Catholics in 1869 could admit this it's a shock. So, because what were some other interesting parts of the book? Like I was looking at.
Apparently, there were some people believing in a 1,000-year reign of absolute papal dominion on the earth.
Wait, what? I missed that part.
Page 32.
Okay. Hold on.
And that reminds me of the papist visionaries talk about the Marian millennium. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I haven't.
Maybe. But I think we should go over some sections of it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm here. This is talking about this, but here the true Catholics are divided into two parties, and it puts true Catholics in quotes. The one party, which is sufficiently educated to understand something of the spirit and tendencies of the age, cherishes no illusions as to the possibility, or at least the near approach, of 1,000 years' reign of absolute papal dominion, and therefore despairs of humanity, which in its scornful blindness has rejected its last anchor of hope. The age we live in is the dark age of anti-Christian dominion, the age of wailing and woe, which is to precede the bodily Antichrist for 2.5 years, after which comes the end of all things in the general judgment. This party was represented in Bavaria by a learned and influential ecclesiastic now dead, who gave it expression in a pastoral of the present Cardinal Raysock. It simply means, as history does not go our way, there shall be no more history, for in other worlds the worlds must come to an end, because our system is not carried out. As their wisdom is at fault, they presume the wisdom of providence is exalted also.
Exhausted.
Exhausted also. Men of this school think a council so near the end of the world superfluous, or at best the last warning given to men rather than wrath and mercy. The other party, and the Jesuits at their head, see in the council the last star of hope, and expect that when papal infallibility and the articles of the syllabus have been proclaimed, mankind will now bow down its proud neck like the royal Sicambrian Clovis, and burn what it adored before, and adore what it burnt. Now that's an interesting. The Jesuits figure very heavily in this book of Lidica. They're kind of like architects of the whole thing.
Yes.
So you'll notice that the next chapter, it deals with the question of things like the Assumption and the new doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. It's pretty short, and then it goes into Ultramontanism, which is, again, since the Ultramontanes won, effectively it's the papal position, but before that it was Ultramontanism, which is how you can always kind of separate out who's going to be gung ho for the idea of the papacy, so on and so forth. So this is not a work of the Holy Fathers, but it is an interesting historical text. That's why we bring it up. Okay, let's see here. Orange Loire wrote, Vladimir Guattei also refuted papal supremacy. He was head historian of the Catholic Church in France. He eventually converted to Eastern Orthodox. Yes, he became Father Vladimir. We do heartily recommend that book. The Schismatic Papacy in French, or the Papacy by Abba Guattei, is one of the seminal works you can read apologetics-wise in terms of getting answers to what Roman Catholics still can't answer the book. They've tried, and I've seen many attempts online, and most of them.
Father Vladimir Guattei also wrote a 12-volume history of the Church of France, or Gaul, and he says he ascribes that as the reason he left Roman Catholicism, when he researched the history of everything and such. Anyway,
so back to this book. Let's take a look here. It's just the table of contents is so much fun. You can just find like all sorts of interesting stuff. It talks about the making the syllabus dogmatic, which is chapter 1. Chapter 2, which is the dogma of Mary. Chapter 3, which is papal infallibility. And it goes through different sections, the consequences of the dogmas of infallibility, errors and contradictions of the popes is a very interesting one.
Interesting how, according to Bellarmine and other Jesuits, the Pope is sometimes designated as "quote-unquote" vice god.
Yeah, that is really weird. I did notice that. It's kind of terrifying. Because it seems that they've taken the theology.
According to some of the Jesuits, St. Paul's saying, "In him we live and move and have our being," can be logically translated to the Pope, since the Pope is the vicar of Christ, and since Christ is God, and therefore he has. It's kind of this very strange way.
The Pope is the new incarnation of Christ. That's insane. Wow. And so there's it's just page 65 is interesting because it talks about the I guess you could say how little the Pope is actually mentioned in terms of the history of the church. It's let's see here. This is an example. Like it talks about Pope Victor, and it says his attempt to compel the churches of Asia Minor to adopt the Roman usage by excluding them from his communion proved a failure. The dispute about the stricter or milder administration of penance, as to whether certain heinous sins should exclude from communion for life, lasted a long time in the Church of Rome, as is elsewhere. There was no trace found of any attempt to force other churches to adopt the principles received at Rome. And even in the 4th century, the Spanish Synod of Elvira established rules differing widely from the Roman. This difference had an intimate relation to dogma. The dispute about heretical baptism in the middle of the 3rd century had a still clearly more dogmatic character, for the whole church doctrine of the efficacy of the and conditions of sacramental grace were involved. Yet the opposition of Pope Stephen to the doctrine, confirmed at several African and Asiatic synods against the validity of schismatical baptism, remained wholly inoperative. Stephen went so far as to exclude those churches from his communion, but he only drew down sharp censures on his unlawful arrogance. Both St. Cyprian and Firmilian of Caesarea denied his having any right to dictate a doctrine to the other bishops and churches. And the other Eastern churches, too, which were not directly mixed in the dispute, retained their own practice for a long time, quite undisturbed by the Roman theory.
I should also point out an interesting section, pages 41 and 42 in the book.
Okay.
And oftentimes we hear about how Orthodoxy is supposedly ethnocentric, and its ethnophilitism is a distinct problem of Orthodoxy. Well, the writers of this text go into detail, quoting what was being taught in Civiltà, which I believe was a Roman official papal newspaper, as well as in papal publications in the 16th, 17th century. And it says, for the church ideal of the Ultramontanes is the Romanizing of all particular churches. Above all, the suppression of every shred of individuality in national churches. All right? Nay, more, they consider it the conscientious duty of all nations to mold themselves to the utmost of their power into the specifically clerico-Italian fashion of thinking and feeling. Now, let me stop there.
Wow.
By this, I don't mean to attack Italians, but why do you think you saw so much adoption of lace, of all these Italian, this late medieval Baroque Italianization into all these different areas in Germany and France? So it's because of that. Okay, so he says, how should they not, when the Civiltà, which is a papal newspaper, says roundly, quote, as the Jews were formerly God's people, so are the Romans under the new covenant. They have a supernatural dignity. All right? That's obviously a statement.
And we're the ethnophilitas.
Yeah, exactly. This reminds me of Bartholomew's statement about how the Slavs are jealous that our race has been given the preeminence by God in the church. At least we can say he's not original. No, he's taking that, like his other doctrines, he's taking that from the papacy. So you see in note 2, it gives the Italian from the newspaper, the official papal newspaper. And then it says in a note, it says, these praises of the so-called Roman people, which no longer exists, for the population of Rome is a mere fluctuating medley of Italians, and especially Italian clerics from all parts of the peninsula, seems to be phrases brought up from a former age. Thus, for example, in 1626, Carriero, provost and professor at Padua, says, quote, the Italians are exalted above the nations by the special grace of God, who gives them in the Pope a spiritual monarch, who has put down from their throne great kings and yet mightier emperors, and set others in their place, to whom the greatest kingdoms have long paid tribute, as they do to no other, and who dispenses such riches to his courtiers that no king or emperor has ever so much to give. The Ultramontanes, it says, know nothing higher than the breath and law of Rome, For him, Rome is an ecclesiastical address, an inquiry office, or rather a standing oracle. The Civilta calls the Pope summum oraculum, the highest oracle,
Wow.
which can give at once an infallible solution of every doubt, speculative or practical. In fact, I remember there was also another papal newspaper that used to always begin with, because it was always afraid about making a mistake and then people reading it as the Pope's doctrine. They would always begin the newspaper when they would reprint the Pope's addresses or allocutions or whatever with something like, "These are the words of the august Holy Father as best we could hear them." That way, if the Pope made a mistake, they could always say, "Oh well, the newspaper misprinted it." Right? Okay. So, any other sections of the book you wanted to go over?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. One of my favorite parts so far is if you look at page 94, it's a section called forgeries, and it's a great start. It reads really. It says at the beginning of the 9th century, no change had taken place in the constitution of the church as we have described it, and especially none as to the authority for deciding matters of faith. When the Frankish bishops came to Leo III, he assured them, far from setting himself above the fathers of the council in 381, who made the additions to the Nicene Creed, he did not venture to put himself on a par with them, and therefore refused to sanction the interpolation of filioque into the creed. But in the middle of that century, about 845, arose the huge fabrication of the Isidorian decretals, which had results far beyond what its author contemplated, and gradually but surely changed the whole constitution and government of the church. It would be difficult to find in all history a second instance of so successful and yet so clumsy a forgery. For 3 centuries past, it has been exposed, yet the principles it introduced and brought into practice have taken such deep root in the soil of the church, the Roman church, and have grown into her life that the exposure of the fraud has produced no result in shaking the dominant system. Now, this is and it continues on. This is amazing because when you bring up things like the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, these authors understand fully the ultimate effects of what the decretals did to Roman Catholicism, which is something that most modern Roman Catholic writers seem either blissfully unaware of or they just ignore it. So it's amazing that in the debate over papal infallibility, you're hearing the same arguments from Roman Catholics that we've said. And it's kind of funny because, if you want a proof that, Roman Catholics understood certain actions of the Pope to be heretical or false, or that there were forgeries in place, this is a fantastic reference text. Again, like what was the Denny's the Papacy? It's flawed, but it's good.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any questions?
Let me take a look. If there are any questions, well, here's the first one. Atomic Lead says, "Isn't a 1,000-year papal dominion of peace more or less what Fatima foretells?" Well, I'm probably going to be debating in Fatima in a little while. There's a few things that are really weird about the Fatima doctrine. There's actually more than a few things, but in any case, the 1,000-year reign of the Pope, I don't think I remember hearing that. I'd have to double check it.
I think they may be talking about the 1,000-year Marian reign of peace.
Yeah, I'm not.
But that's millennialism.
But I don't remember. I'm still not sure I read that in Fatima though. Okay. I mean, I could double check. I'll double check that. But
there are so many other additional visionaries in the 20th century that
they're all hearing different things. And then Orange Luai wrote, "Funny if you asked a Protestant in America 100 years ago, they would have said Catholicism is for the Poles, Italians, and Irish." Mm-hmm. That's true. And that's in that sense. I guess they've kind of spread somewhat. So they've kind of Roman Catholicism in America is pretty much Protestant in terms of its basic practice and worship, with the exception of a few traditionalists. But in any case, if there are any other questions, comments, again, the book we're reading is The Pope and the Council. If you look in the top of the chat, you can find it. We'll be referencing pieces of it as we go through it. And again, this is, if you have questions or comments, this is our last regular show of the season until next year. So Sean points out, in a word, chiliasm. Yes, basically. But as to whether, and it's true, whether it's a papal chiliasm or a Marian chiliasm or a Christian chiliasm, it's still chiliasm. So let's see here. Did you what other interesting parts did you notice yourself in the book of Laodica?
Mainly, there's the section with the Pseudo Isidorian Decretos. I think that's well worth a read. So,
Yeah, that's in forgeries, right? Or is there a whole
yes,
section?
some forgeries.
Yeah, because it's let me see here, because I'll see if I can follow this. Go back up to where that starts. Okay. Mm-hmm. It says to continue. It says about 100 pretended decrees of the earliest popes, together with this is about the decretals, together with certain spurious writings of other church dignitaries and acts of synods that were then fabricated in the west of Gaul and eagerly seized upon by Pope Nicholas I at Rome to be used as genuine documents in support of the new claims put forward by himself and his successors. The immediate object of the compiler of this forgery was to protect bishops against their metropolitans, excuse me, and other authorities, so as to secure absolute impunity and the exclusion of all influence of the secular power. This end was to be gained through such an immense extension of papal power that, as these principles gradually penetrated into the church and were followed out into their consequences, she necessarily assumed the form of an absolute monarchy subjected to the arbitrary power of a single individual, and the foundation of the edifice of papal infallibility was first already laid. First, by the principle that the decrees of every council require papal confirmation. Secondly, by the assertion that the fullness of power, even in matters of faith, resides in the Pope alone, who is bishop of the universal church, while the other bishops are just his servants. Now, if the Pope is really the bishop of the whole church, so that every other bishop is his servant, he, who is the sole legitimate mouth of the church, ought to be infallible. If the decrees of councils are invalid without papal confirmation, the divine institution of a doctrine undeniably rests in the last resort on the word of one man. And the notion of the absolute power of that one man over the whole church includes that of his infallibility, as well as the shell contains the kernel. With perfect consistency, therefore, the Pseudo-Isidore makes his early popes say the Roman Church remains to the end free from the stains of heresy. Formerly, all learned students of ecclesiastical antiquity and canon law, men like DeMarca, Baluz, Constant, Gibbert, Berardi, Alwain, etc., were agreed that this change introduced by the Pseudo-Isidore was a substantial one, that it displaced the old system of church government and brought in the new. Modern writers have maintained that the compiler of the forgery only meant to codify the existing state of things and give it a formal status, and that this same development would have taken place without his trick. The truth is, first, before his fabrication, many very efficacious forgeries had won a gradual recognition at Rome since the beginning of the 6th century, and on them was based the maxim that the Pope, as supreme in the church, could be judged by no man. Secondly, the Pseudo-Isidorian doctrine contradicted itself, for it aimed at two things which were mutually incompatible: the complete independence and impunity of bishops on the one hand, and the advancement of papal power on the other. The first point it sought to effect by such strange and unpractical rules that they never attained any real vitality, while on the contrary, the principles about the power of the Roman See worked their way and became dominant under favorable circumstances, but with a result greatly opposed to the views of Isidore by bringing the bishops into complete subjection to Rome. But that the Pseudo-Isidorian principles eventually revolutionized the whole constitution of the church and introduced a whole new system in place of the old, on that point there can be no controversy among candid historians. Now, it's worth noting that after the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals and Nicholas I, Rome falls into a period of heavy decline. So one of the things when we talk about the invention of the Roman Church by Hildebrand, is that Hildebrand, in his longing to restore what he believes is the original Petrine concept of the church, the kind of delusion that he's going by, is the decretals themselves. Mm-hmm. He's actually assuming that this is the sort of power that popes had, even though the whole thing was a forgery just to get kings off of bishops' backs. Mm-hmm. So in the end...
now, of course, and you remember, there are several existing anti-Hildebrandian tracts from the late 11th century. Oftentimes it's very difficult to get a hold of them. For example, the famous New York tract, sometimes called the Norman Anonymous.
Yes.
And you can find sections of it translated online in English historical documents 1042 to 1189. And in Tractate 4, which was written somewhere in the 1080s, it says, quote, the church, so this is basically the old Western view that opposed the so-called Hildebrandian or Gregorian reform, that says, quote, the church which is in Jerusalem is the mother of all the churches. For she was the first to receive from Christ the grace and knowledge of the faith and the sevenfold gifts of the Holy Ghost, the Comforter from heaven. For the Church of Rome was given precedence over her, not by Christ or his apostles, but by men. For as the Holy Fathers themselves bear witness, the Church of Rome was accorded this by virtue of secular power and the dignity of the city, Nevertheless, this was the work of men and not of God. So the counter view was that Rome's precedence, even of honor, wasn't by divine right, but it was by custom, even if by the councils, which is very much opposed to what the Hildebrandian view, or his summation of the view that it's not just a precedence of divine right, but it's even far greater than just a precedence. It's a immediate supremacy.
Yeah, which is what he put into place with the Dictatus Papae.
Yes.
Now this is let me see here. Atomic Lead as Dollinger was one of the people writing as Janus, wasn't he? It never goes into detail. In the beginning, it talks about a group of concerned citizens, and that's why they chose the name Janus. Being the two-faced Roman god, it could be a male or a female writing. You have no idea. The whole idea is it may as well have just been signed by Anonymous. But in any case,
and again, we're not endorsing everything in the book.
No, a lot of it.
For example, a lot of this is written by people who would later become the Old Catholics in Utrecht. And the problem is that they didn't have you can detect in the book that their ecclesiology was kind of beginning to be weakened. And I think what happened was that they had become so scarred by the fact of the papacy that they almost began to move into a branch theory-like understanding of stuff. Now, it's not too evident in this book, but that's kind of what happens later on, if you know what I'm talking about, right? So the book, like other books we talked about, you can find other Anglicans writing interesting books. You can look at Thomas Ally's books, for example, Greenwood, etc. Read them for the facts they bring up and the little-known historical episodes, all right? Not for other opinions that, for example, that we wouldn't agree with, obviously. So
yeah, and that's again. Remember, it is a Roman Catholic book, but it is a very handy one to have because it does fully cover a lot of these problems, and basically shows you the development not just of papal infallibility, but also the development of the papacy of the Roman Catholic Church from its beginning.
Now he gives an example, and this is something you have to look at, where the Hildebrandians would take earlier decrees, even legitimate conciliar decrees from a Roman council or a pope, and they would apply them and distort them to mean something different. On page 111. Okay. It says on page 111, it says Pope Agatho had said at a Roman synod in 680 that all the English bishops were to observe the ordinances made in former Roman synods for the Anglo-Saxon Church. Cardinal Deus Dedit, who I believe is 1100 or so.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. He made this into a decree issued by Agatho to all the bishops in the world, saying they must receive all papal orders as though attested by the very voice of Peter, and therefore, of course, infallible. One of the boldest fabrications the Gregorians allowed themselves occurs first in Anselm's, and then in Cardinal Gregory's work, from whom Gratian borrowed it. St. Augustine had said that all those canonical writings of the Bible were preeminently attested, which the apostolical churches had first received and possessed. He meant the churches of Corinth, Ephesus, etc. The passage was corrupted into, quote, those epistles belong to the canonical writings which the Holy See has issued, end quote. And thus it came to pass that the medieval theologians and canonists, who generally derived their whole knowledge of the fathers from the passages collected by Peter Lombard and Gratian, really believed that St. Augustine had put the decretal letters of popes on a par with Scripture. When Cardinal Torquemada, about 1450, and Cardinal Cajetan, about 1516, put the infallibility doctrine into formal shape, they too relied on the clear testimony of St. Augustine, which left no doubt that the first theologian of the ancient church had declared every papal utterance to be as free from error as the apostolical epistles. Now, of course, St. Augustine didn't say any of that, all right? But you can see how they took, for example, a decree of Pope Agatho and a statement by St. Augustine and twisted them to mean something completely different than what they were saying.
And the footnotes are just fantastic in this. It says, it points out this error, this false forgery of St. Agatho. It says it occurs in the same spurious form in Gregory's Polycarpus, Evo's collection, Evo of Charters, and which, of course, was quite conclusive in Gratian's Decretum. Mm-hmm. So the point is, these forgeries weren't just placed in one spot. They were placed, they'd kind of copy each other. And so they were literally manufacturing Roman Catholicism before your eyes.
And you can also tell by, we've talked about Aquinas' book against the Greeks. where the vast majority of the quotations are just forgeries. They don't exist in any real text, right? Now, did they know that? I don't. Maybe not. But it shows you that the learning of the vast majority of these 12th, 13th, and 14th century Roman Catholic polemicists who were attacking orthodoxy was based upon heavily interpolated and fabricated material. So they didn't really have access to the fathers, and I think that was intentional. They didn't, why would the papacy, the Hildebrandians, want them to have access to authentic texts of the fathers?
Well, it's amazing when you read some of this stuff. Like I'm looking here on page 115, it says Gregory VII, that's Hildebrand, seems to have sincerely believed that his infallibility was already acknowledged throughout the Christian world, even in the East. He wrote to the Emperor Henry, quote, "The Greek church has fallen away and the Armenians have also lost the right faith, but," he adds, "all the Easterns await from St. Peter, from me, the decision on their various opinions, and at this time will the promise of Peter's confirming his brethren be fulfilled." End quote. He wanted then, in 1074, to go at the head of a great army to Constantinople, and there to hold his solemn judgment in matters of faith, for he does not seem to have counted on the voluntary submission of the Greeks, instead of which he contented himself with plunging Germany and Italy into a religious and civil war, the end of which he did not live to see.
Now, I should note also, remember, Hildebrand, about that time or a little bit afterwards, was going to plunge Germany into religious war, because remember, he supported the so-called anti-king against the Emperor Henry.
This is after the Synod of Brixen, which was in 1080.
Exactly.
Yeah, which deposed him. And so it's fascinating that it all ties together right where we said. And people have asked us on the show before, previously, like, are there any books that talk about, the Hildebrandian invention of Roman Catholicism? There's a lot of them. It's just that, it's not usually taken to its logical conclusion. In this one, it is. So this is definitely one that I recommend reading, just for the parts that deal with the schism of the 11th century. But in any case, again, it's not perfect. It refers to Thomas Aquinas as St. Thomas, even though it points out he's wrong. It does have some strange Roman Catholic beliefs in it, because, they're kind of similar in that way to old Catholics, as Flatica Enoch has mentioned. But it's worth reading just to get a lot of the history and the quotations, because it does list where they are and things like that. Sometimes you may need a little bit of work finding the text, but they're all there. So it's in that sense, it's really a useful little book to have.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me see here. And as we continue, let's see. I'm going to go to comments right now because we're getting some. Let's see. Sean Ridlin writes, "St. Peter was so infallible that St. Paul rebuked him. His authority so universal, St. James presided over him." Very true. Ronald Patchirek writes, "I haven't been able... where the church fathers issued a canon where the Bishop of Rome had precedence, if you will, over other bishops." Yes, that's one of the points I made 20 years ago in a debate over papal supremacy. There is no canon which establishes it whatsoever. Ronald Patrick says, "I've heard St. Ignatius' articulate precedence to Rome, but St. Ignatius was alive during St. Peter's lifetime." Yes, that's true, but I don't know that it was precedence to say in St. Ignatius. Because he really developed the I guess you could say, the episcopal centrality of the church.
I'm confused. What's the question exactly about the St. Ignatius?
Well, no, it's that he also said, I suspect this may be a tribute to St. Peter, Christ's apostle, and not the office. Well, St. Ignatius did show respect to the apostle Peter, obviously, but that does not translate into some sort of divine supremacy for Rome. So, in any case, definitely, this is definitely an interesting book to have. Atomic Lead asks, do you know of any other sources other than the Synod of Brixen that mention that John Bracciantus was Gregory VII's hired poisoner? I haven't found any myself. To be quite honest, I'm pretty sure that after the Synod of Brixen and after the Hildebrandians won, they would have gone out of their way to destroy documents like that. But you'd have to.
Well, remember also there was a civil war in Germany after Brixen deposed the Pope. I believe again, you got to look up the anti-king, the anti-Saxon king. What was his name?
Hold on. Wait a second. Oh, see if I can find that.
The Gaggen König, I believe it was called in German or something like that. Let's see.
The fourth.
It was Conrad. I'm not sure. Anyway, there was a civil war that erupted in Germany because of Hildebrand, and again,
Yeah, let me see.
it could have been a Rudolf of Rheinfelden.
Okay, yeah.
He was he was the anti-king, and he was basically the supporter of Hildebrand, I believe. So
Now the question is, who was the poisoner, though? That's going to be trickier to find, because again, the synod clearly knew what they were dealing with, and they were mentioning contemporaries that probably have been lost to history.
well, remember the account that was that was written in the 1080s by there was who was the cardinal that had been originally kind of in communion with Hildebrand, but then he kind of turned against him in the 1080s.
That Peter Damian, or
no, Albinus, something like that. And he was the one that wrote about. It's in the book called Investiture Controversy. Anyway, he wrote about how Hildebrand, when Alexander the Second, I think, and who was Alexander the Second? Was he in like the Pope before Hildebrand or the Pope before the Pope? He made some sort of a sermon in which he said that, he believed the emperor had the right to, he had sent a letter or that the emperor had the right to monitor the elections to make sure everything was correct in them. And remember, after that, Hildebrand basically
took him out to a room and had him beaten.
Yeah, he was stripped naked, and he was beaten until he told him where the letter was, so he could, intercept it.
Yeah. And one of the things to remember is that the Synod of Brixen, in this particular case, doesn't just mention that Gregory VII, he was Hildebrand's hired poisoner. He mentions that the Synod actually heard his confession that he was the poisoner. And this means that they didn't just know of a John Brickinthus who was the poisoner. They're saying that the poisoner literally admitted who he was and what he had done. So, that's a pretty big deal. But in any case, it all comes back to, once again, the real inventor of the Roman Catholic Church. And with that, let us take a look here. What else is interesting in the book? Because this is, we've been, suggesting it, because it is definitely a worthwhile read if this is the sort of thing you look for if you argue with Roman Catholics about infallibility a lot. Let's see here. I thought it was. I read the thing with the false union at Florence, which was pretty interesting.
Now he makes the writers make an interesting point on page 122. They say the conduct of the popes since Innocent I and Zosimus, that's around the year 400 and early 400s, and constantly quoting the Sardican canons, which we know those three famous canons.
Yeah.
On appeals now they were quoting them as a canon of Nicaea. In other words, oftentimes the popes would say Nicaea says you can appeal on a certain case to the pope or whatever. Now the writers of the book say this cannot be exactly ascribed to conscious fraud. The arrangement of their collection of canons misled them. There was more deliberate purpose in inserting in the Roman So in other words, oftentimes even in Rome they didn't really have in the early 400s accurate editions of the canons of even Nicaea. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes when they would say the Nicene canon says this, that's because they would just indiscriminately put all the canons into one big book. However, he goes on and says there were more deliberate purpose in inserting in the Roman manuscripts of the Sixth Nicene Canon, quote, the Roman Church always had the primacy, of which there is no syllable in the original. A fraud exposed at the Council of Chalcedon to the confusion of the Roman legates by reading the original. Toward the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century, the process of forgery and fictions in the interest of Rome was actively carried on. Then began the compilation. I don't agree with this compilation.
Yeah, this part is a bit of the 19th century modernism.
That's the Bollandist stuff they're going into there.
That's where they start saying, oh, this
so again, I don't agree with everything in the book, but if they can point out, because you see, look at this, they don't actually give any quotations at the very bottom except one reference in Mansi, but that's actually to the Council of Chalcedon reference.
Right, yeah.
All right. So again, if they actually start referencing stuff with notes, that's a much more legitimate argument.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, in that sense, it's definitely it's a flawed read. So it's actually fun to kind of take apart fact from fiction in it, because again, it was written by 19th century liberal Roman Catholics who had already some of the modernism in there. So we're here to take questions, comments. If you've read the book and you have an opinion, let us know. And we'll keep going, and that's what we've been doing.
If anyone has access or knows a way to get access to the transcribed text for the Norman Anonymous. There used to be a website called the Electronic Norman Anonymous Project, and it was given like a $200,000 grant.
Yeah.
But it's since disappeared from the internet, and it's kind of difficult to read some of the manuscripts. So if anyone out there has any idea, because we tried the Wayback Machine.
Yeah, we tried to find it. It used to have a website. I think it was normananonymous.org or something.
Yeah.
And it's gone. And apparently the web host erased previous links. So that's too bad. But hopefully if somebody can find the full text, very helpful, because they were going to do a print edition, it even said. So I don't know that they actually did one. But in any case, let's see here. So while we're waiting there, we're going to, if anyone has questions, we're going to take a look at some of the questions that we've seen. What's it called? Take a look at some of the stuff that's been discussed on the War Room and on the War Zone. So let's see here. There was a question. One person had said on the War Zone, I want to study ancient church history with my wife. She loves history, and so do I. However, she comes from a non-denominational background in theological persuasion, something I'd like to change. What books do you recommend besides diving into primary sources? Well, we generally recommend primary sources. What's it called? I'm going to actually put a link that we're answering this here, because the truth is, just starting with the Apostolic Fathers is a great start.
The first epistle of Clement.
Yeah, start there.
Yeah.
Basically,
I think people have to get away from this idea of being afraid to read the Apostolic Fathers. I don't know why. They're very simple, but they're very explicit.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about how we must eat the flesh and blood of Christ. Where the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church. I mean, they're very explicit about these matters. They're so explicit that you read them, you have to understand there's no other way around it.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. One of the things that, there are collections you can even find of books of the Apostolic Fathers. And so, basically, if you just give me a second, I'm going to tell them to just, I want to tell this person to go to minute 40, because that's really where we started talking about it. But there are collections of the Apostolic Fathers, and I mean, I wouldn't say they can be read in a night, but they can definitely be read in a week. And you would learn a million times more about the Orthodox faith from the Apostolic Fathers than you would from almost any introductory book. And the Apostolic Fathers are actually in some ways accessible to some Protestant backgrounds. They speak in the language of the Scriptures, and they are in some ways closer and maybe more accessible to somebody coming from a Protestant background. So I would never tell. I would say, why waste your time with tertiary sources when you can go to the Apostolic Fathers themselves?
Someone else asked the question, can someone explain to me how economia works and how it is applied to loosen the application of certain canons? Who gets to decide which rules can be bent? Well, first off, economy in regards to the canons works really only in regards to disciplinary canons. It doesn't really have a reference to dogmatic or dogmatic and moral canons. Who gets to decide which rules can be bent? Well, I don't know if you'd say the word bent, but generally the bishop or the synod of bishops.
It's not even an issue of bending the rules. It's an issue of having mercy for infirmity. A perfect example is the church's fasting rules. Those can't be applied if you're, say, a good example is a person with diabetes.
Pregnant women.
Pregnant women.
That's exactly in the apostolic. I'm saying in the end of the Pedalion, the canons of the Holy Fathers, it's either St. Nicephorus or one of the maybe Patriarch Tiresias. It says explicitly that pregnant women do not have to fast. Because it says the purpose of fasting, one of the purposes is the humbling of the body. And the pregnant woman is such a physical condition that her body is in very humble condition already.
Exactly. So there's reasons for economia when they're good reasons. Some people like to just throw the word around and they think they can do whatever they want. but proper exercise of economia comes from the bishop, and it should be, a bishop rightly dividing the word of truth. And if so, then sometimes he'll relax a rule if it needs to be relaxed. So that's what we'd have to say on that.
There was a recent roundtable discussion about the Immaculate Conception, Father Joseph.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting because I was actually in that debate. I did listen to Craig Trulia's comment.
You were in the roundtable discussion of the.
I was not in the roundtable discussion. I was in the debate with William Albrecht, who's the second left on the bottom. And I thought I was going to actually be in this discussion. I'm not upset about it because, frankly, Craig basically, had the correct answers on a lot of these things, so he was able to disarm a lot of the Roman Catholic claims.
Now, were all these individuals Roman Catholic except for Craig?
Well, Michael Lofton, obviously, he's kind of like in between. Eric is Roman Catholic. William Albrecht's Roman Catholic. The other guy, from what I understand, is a Protestant who was a friend of, I think a friend of Craig's. I'm not sure, but the point is that, so. It would have been interesting, but as I mentioned, they're doing a show on Fatima, and so my natural tendency towards skepticism on that will be on full display on Monday when I join in the discussion I invited myself to.
So you're going to have to reread the Fatima prophecies, I guess, right?
Oh well, yeah, that's why I was already doing that, which is why I didn't notice this 1,000-year reign. I mean, I noticed like all sorts of interesting stuff.
Are you going to bring? Well,
let's talk about it.
Are you going to bring up the stuff about the kind of space alien looking?
I was looking for that. I really wanted to find the text for that again. I got to look in the war room for it, but definitely I was going to bring that up. Yeah, space alien Our Lady is definitely one that I want to bring up. There's a few other things that we'll be talking about, but some interesting stuff to say the least. So that should be an interesting Monday.
Well, we have about 13 minutes left.
Oh, we're just doing an hour today?
Well, if people have questions, we'll go longer, but if no,
yeah.
13 minutes.
Definitely. If you have questions and you want to ask more questions or have some discussions, that's I'm looking forward to it. So let's take a look here. What else? Has there ever been Coptic or Ethiopian Orthodox converting to Eastern Orthodox after coming to understand the difference? Yeah, actually, some of them are in the war room. We had a couple of people who mentioned that they were actually of the Monophysite groups, and then they learned Miaphysites, and they learned the truth, and they converted to Orthodoxy. So, yeah, no, it does happen. Usually it's from people who were, cradle Miaphysite or Monophysite, and they eventually realize, wait a second, there's some serious dogmatic inconsistency here, and that's when they become Orthodox. Now, it's interesting to note, and this is one of the things that I thought was interesting, which recently there was the Pope granted Mar Nursus or something, like one of these Nestorians, I think, to be a doctor of the church. And this was kind of a shock for a lot of the Roman Catholic traditionalists, but it makes perfect sense within their system because their system is ultimately syncretic. Effectively, what they're doing is they're taking all these different groups with all these different beliefs, kind of shoving their saints in, and then saying, well, all you have to do is recognize Rome, and that's the sort of disaster you're going to develop. So it's a pretty interesting thing. So yeah, Son of Seth, it has happened, and God willing, it'll keep happening. Wasn't there actually a whole mission to the Armenians, for example, by the Russians in I think it was like the 17th century or?
There was in the 19th century, there definitely was. I don't know how successful. I think they did have some churches, and I know there's a lot of history about pre-revolutionary Russia and how everything went on. That's people just have chosen not to translate it. I mean, for example, the famous mission to the Nestorians, where they converted something like 60,000 Nestorians in Iraq and Iran. That's only known because somebody wrote an article, Father Alexa Young, or somebody wrote an article like 30 years ago, 40 years ago in Orthodox Word or something like that. All right. And that was because one of their bishops had actually died was 100 years old, and he ended up dying in the 70s in Spring Valley or something. Or no, not Spring Valley. Is Novodevio in Spring Valley?
Yeah. That's Spring Valley.
So, I mean, there's a lot of these actual interesting missionary circumstance that we don't really know a lot about, but there was some sort of mission to the Armenians. I'm pretty sure it all got destroyed once the revolution happened, and then the Bolsheviks destroyed, basically smashed, killed most of the Orthodox, or most of the Orthodox clergy at the very least. But now, what is true is that I do recall that when Saint Photius wrote a letter to the Western bishops in the 860s, complaining about Pope Nicholas and warning them of all these problems, and saying, and actually in the letter, I think Saint Photius implies that the Western emperor, should go into Rome and hold a synod and depose Pope Nicholas, by the way, which actually happened 100 years later with John the 12th, by the way. The Autonian emperor actually made good on that. Although, by the way, Emperor Charles the Bold, who he may have been emperor during the time of Photius, Saint Photius, actually made a threat along with the Frankish bishops that they would in fact depose either Nicholas or the succeeding pope if he didn't stop his behavior and in trying to impose himself on the German and French churches. Which is why, by the way, not to go off this, that many Roman Catholics would try to maintain that Saint Photius was conspiring with the Frankish court to depose the pope or whatever. Although I'm not sure how much of it is conspiracy if you're publicly saying you need to get rid of this guy. But where's it going? Oh, yes. St. Photius in this letter, I believe, says that the Armenians, or large portions of the Armenians, had come back to the faith, the historic faith in the 860s. There's something like 30 or 35 Armenian bishops that were accepted back into the church during the time of St. Photius. I think that's where there's a famous phrase, maybe. Anyway, but yeah, there was always this mission, and what ended up happening was in the 10th century, after there was some sort of breakdown in relations between the emperor in Constantinople and the Orthodox Armenians, and then there's a nationalistic reaction, and they ended up doing a lot of damage to Orthodoxy in Armenia. Monophysitism kind of came back into power. But, many of the emperors were actually Armenian Orthodox. Orthodox Armenians were actually did exist. For example, most of what we call Eastern Asia Minor was actually called Greater Armenia. And they weren't just Monophysites. Most of them were actually Orthodox. And they were called the Kayet by the other Armenians, which means traitor or schismatic.
It's like the term Melkite for the Orthodox.
Although Melkite for the Orthodox sorry. But anyway, go ahead. Continue talking, Father.
Yeah. There's in that sense, there have been a lot of conversions historically that have happened, and just keep doing research. You'll find more, and you'll probably meet a few as you do. Let's see. EN7 says, have you read the Sedevacantists delusion why Vatican II's clash with Sedevacantism supports Eastern Orthodoxy? I've heard the book. I've heard of the book. I have not read it yet. Most of what I've heard about it has been extremely positive, and I wish the author well in bringing more people out of Sedevacantism. It's kind of a tragic religion, and it always leads to bizarre conclusions. I spent part of the week earlier with this some internet conclavist group or person, I don't know, it could be alt accounts, who calls himself Boniface the Sixth or Boniface the 10th, excuse me, and declares himself Pope of Rome. Now, conclavists are a unique brand of Sedevacantists in that they basically believe that since everything is so far gone, that all you have to do is get some Roman Catholics together and elect a new pope. And so that's what they did with Pope Michael, David Bauden, Lucian Pulvermacher, and some guy who is heretofore anonymous, declaring himself Boniface X.
Also, don't forget the people in Spain.
Oh yeah, no, well that's
the Palomarians.
The Palomar de Troya, group that was like they're the originals. They started in like the 70s or something.
They come from the Tuke lines.
Yeah. So anyway,
they have money behind them somehow. I don't know, but they have money behind them.
I think it's because they're they had a much better reputation, if I remember correctly.
Well, some of them are. But that depends. There've been all kinds of scandals there, though, too.
Oh yeah, no, since. But the whole point is that the Palmarians, at the very least, had a functioning body. I mean, most of these neo-conclavists tend towards the conclusion that they're like they're like isolated people who work through their their stuff. Yeah, as Sean put it, their group has swag, though. Yeah, I'll agree with that.
What does that mean?
They've got stuff. In other words, they actually.
Yeah. They have like a gigantic
like cathedral and stuff.
And I think they're the ones that came up with all these new doctrines, Marian revelations, and Marian, like when you receive communion, you also receive the body and blood of the Theotokos and Saint Joseph now.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff. I mean, what usually happens is that when you have a small group like this, especially if Sedevacantists Roman Catholics have become conclavist or whatever,
they become wackier and wackier.
Because now they have these nuns having visions, and there's no larger organization to kind of put a stamp to it or kind of try to dampen it down a little bit.
Now they run the show.
Yeah.
Now, some atomic lead-us, I sort of hate to ask this, but any particular thoughts on the Amazon Synod and the Pachamama nonsense?
It's blasphemy.
Well, it's more than blasphemy. I mean, I hate to say it. It's evil. Maybe it's it is demonic. You're taking away my ability to say that it is also grossly entertaining, since it's happening. Couldn't happen to a better group of people. To be quite honest, it's disgusting. The fact that somebody called the Pope of Rome is actually putting statues on the altar. I read an interesting comment though, because they someone threw the statues into the river, and someone mentioned they managed to recover the statues. And the question was, why didn't they just destroy the statues, as opposed to giving them a chance to come back? Like, the people are actually getting to that paranoid point where they're like, maybe this was all a false flag operation to show their support for Pachamama.
I have a question. I can't say I followed all of this really. Am I correct in saying, from what I understand, that at this Amazon Synod, which was in Brazil, correct?
Brazil. Mm-hmm.
That the papacy approved the devotion to this statue called Pachamama, which is supposed to be a combination of indigenous syncretistic devotion to the Virgin, along with kind of pagan goddesses, right?
Well, Pachamama straight up is an Inca, what do you call it, goddess, an earth goddess.
Is it an Inca word, or is it a combination of Spanish and Inca?
No, that's an Inca word.
Because the mama doesn't mean mother, then it's something else.
Right? No, it might actually, because that does happen throughout languages, and I'm not an expert on Quechua, but I do know that Pachamama sounds very much like a Quechua word.
Okay.
So, but in any case, it is actually a deity, and the point is that the original cover-up that they tried for was to say that, it's actually about a devotion to the Mother of God. That was their cover, but they had the statues present in the church liturgically, and those are not statues of the Theotokos or some Pachamamaized Theotokos. It's just Pachamama.
And they put them on the altars and incensed them.
Then they brought them to Rome and put them on the altar there.
Yeah.
So
obviously, there's really no. They don't even have a very good cover anymore. They can't deny this.
Yeah, and so in the sense that it exposes the truth, I'm kind of cool with it. But everything else about it is pretty much horrible. And so let's see here. Now, this is Ronald is asking: were the churches of Britannia, namely Lindisfarne and Grenada, under the Bishop of Rome, or were they autonomous? Autocephalous might be the correct term. Precism, Britannia, and Grenada. And I think you'd probably be better to answer this. Granda, sorry.
Can you look up where Granda is?
Granda, hold on.
I'm not familiar with Granda.
I assume it's one of the British Isles. It's the capital city of the Protestant. Oh, no, that took me to Grenada. Okay, hold on. Give me a second. I'm going to try to Google.
Well, I can tell you that technically they did still commemorate, as I understand, they commemorated the Bishop of Rome in the canon of the Mass. So they recognized him as their patriarch. In the case of the British churches, they have this system where by the early 600s, they didn't really have any longer any metropolitans. So they didn't really have to send anybody to Rome to get the pallium.
They were just like, they were operated under what, the Archbishop of Lindisfarne or the Archbishop?
There was no Archbishop of Lindisfarne.
Oh,
really? Lindisfarne was founded by Lindisfarne was found. Wait a minute, hold on. I'm not mistaken here. Lindisfarne, am I correct, is on the west side, the east side of Britain, correct? Up near Scotland.
Let me see here. It's the island of Lindisfarne. It is. Let me see on the map. Yeah, it's kind of on the east. Okay.
Yes. Okay. That's where Saint Cuthbert of Lindisfarne.
Saint Aidan of Lindisfarne.
Cuthbert. Yeah, Saint Cuthbert.
Yeah, Saint Cuthbert.
Yeah, and that's also because the last bishop of Lindisfarne was actually the first bishop of Durham. Yeah, I have the Durham ritual was owned by the last bishop of Lindisfarne too. Lindisfarne would have been basically was technically a dependency of the Archbishop of York.
Okay, so York was okay.
So I mean, I think you can't be too crazy with some of this stuff. I mean, technically they all recognize the papacy to some extent to being the patriarch. It's just so, you can make an argument that some of the British bishops, by British we mean like the Welsh type bishops, that since they didn't have any metropolitan any longer, they didn't really go to Rome a lot, although some of their pilgrims did. And then there was the issue of the schism at Whitby, where the Welsh kind of claimed that unless you celebrated Pascha on the wrong date.
Oh, that's 664. Okay.
Yes, and of course the Welsh were kind of violent. They would attack Anglo-Saxon priests if they celebrated Pascha on the wrong day and murder them too. So that's kind of why St. Theodore of Canterbury, when he came in, people attack him, but he was kind of harsh on the Welsh. He wasn't super harsh on the Irish, as long as the Irish stayed over in Ireland and they didn't cause problems over in England and such. But I think it might be better to call them autonomous if they were, which might be.
They don't remember. It's important to note that the pre-schism Western churches followed roughly, but not exactly, because neither did the Eastern churches at the time, the concepts of autonomy versus autocephaly. Sometimes they granted themselves privileges that were not thought of as typical to autonomous at the time, and sometimes they were more subservient in ways we wouldn't expect. So the concepts of autonomy and autocephaly were still very much in development, even in those first 10 centuries.
Yes.
So yeah, that's important to remember. So
for example, it's difficult to use in a modern sense, because in a modern sense, in the East, this is developed by the time we have now, only a first hierarch can consecrate chrism as a rule, generally. So only the head of an autocephalous church is technically generally allowed to consecrate chrism. All right. However, that's kind of more or less a development that happened in the East in the late first millennium to basically the early, maybe like the 1200s, 1300s, etc., going on. That was not the concept in the West before the Great Schism. Their concept was that all ruling bishops, if they were ruling bishops, not auxiliary bishops, could consecrate chrism. So they really didn't have a super dependency upon the papacy, if you know what I mean. They didn't need approval for the papacy to have elections of vicar bishops, of ruling bishops. They could elect their own archbishops or metropolitans. The question, though, was that should he go to Rome to receive the pallium or not? And oftentimes they did. And that was simply a fait accompli. The Pope just either had to give them the pallium, or if he agreed with it, or not give them the pallium if he didn't agree with it. But if he didn't give them the pallium, then they might just take the pallium themselves.
Yeah. And that's actually what happened. Didn't that happen after
the
Three
pallium
Chapters controversy?
Yeah, well, that happened with the Istrian schism. That's a little bit complicated, but that led to issues of like what was called the Patriarchate of Aquileia.
Yeah.
And that was recognized as a patriarchate. Now, St. Photius did not recognize it as a patriarchate, although he claims it was an autocephalous church. St. Photius' view is that technically there should only be 5 patriarchs for typological reasons of the 5 hands, the 5 senses. Although he did say the Patriarch of Aquileia was an autocephalous archbishop. All right. So, but when you deal with stuff in Britain, I was reading through Father Seraphim Rose's letters, and I posted them on one of my Facebook pages or whatever, in which he gives a warning about, and I think it's a very wise warning. He gives a warning about the whole obsession some people have with the super obsession with the Celtic stuff. And it's not to attack Celtic saints or Celtic devotions if they're Orthodox, and they are. Okay. But he says that a lot of the people, how they treat it, he says it's eerily similar to old believer attitudes. All right. And you have to look at those letters he wrote about that, where he says they want to attack everything that was Roman, even if it's hundreds of years prior to the schism, and not opposed to Orthodoxy. All right. Because they have created a false distinction between, let's say,
it's an ethnic religious fetishism. Is what
yes, and that people want to get rid of their own ethnicity so they can become Celticized.
Yeah,
because there's this air that's been created where Celtic is assumed to be almost Pelagian. It's
pure.
It's against authoritarianism. It's just ridiculous. If people met the Celtic saints would be giving you penances of like 350 prostrations every hour.
I'd hate to think what they do to St. Patrick's Day revelers.
Yeah, they would probably become they'd probably be arrested on the street for disrupting the parade and preaching about how this is devil worship and evil. I mean, when you're dealing with some of these Irish and Scottish saints, they were extremely ascetic men. They would not only sing their extensive divine office every day, they would also repeat the whole Psalter every day. They would, wear, I think they would wear hair shirts.
Yeah, they did wear hair shirts.
They would wear things that were uncomfortable. They would stand in freezing water to recite the Psalter. They would not wear shoes in some cases. You're dealing with, I mean, this did not mean they were necessarily cruel people, all right? But they were not the lovey-dovey hippie type people that some of these folks imagine them to be.
Yeah.
It's not how they were.
After hour 10 of prayer, you can start considering referring to yourself as a Celtic Christian if you can.
And you've done it for 10 years consecutively.
Yeah. Then you're believable.
Just one day a year or something like that.
Yeah.
But my point is that I think but again, was the British Church, by the British Church, they mean the Welsh. I'd have to say that it got cut off from contact with Rome. They still did have pilgrims go there. St. Wilfrid of York, when he was at the 680 Roman Synod, does testify that they were still Orthodox. He says they held the same doctrines as the English in the Gauls, etc. But the question as to were they, no churches at that time were heavily dependent on just going to the Pope for every single answer. They didn't even think about doing that.
It was not a concept that existed to them.
Yes, the most you'd have is if there was some major controversy there was synod after synod trying to solve it. They would finally say, let's have the Pope as an arbiter. All right.
Yeah, and then in many cases they didn't like what he said.
And then they'd ignored it. For example, that's what happened with St. Theodore of Canterbury. St. Theodore of Canterbury, for example, when he came into Britain in the early 660s, he began to carve up the diocese of St. Wilfrid and say, well, look, Wilfrid, your diocese is too big. I'm the only metropolitan archbishop. Even though, and so I'm going to carve up your diocese. St. Wilfrid was like, well, this is not according to the canons. You can't do this. And so I think they took it to Rome. Eventually, after enough dispute in Britain, they took it to Rome, and the Pope actually ruled in favor of St. Wilfrid, but St. Theodore basically just ignored it. All right. There was also the case of this, I think the Synod of Calcutta, or one of the similar synods in the 780s, in which there's a big dispute because they had erected a third archbishopric in Britain called the Archbishop of Lichfield.
Okay.
And now remember, when they used the term archbishop, it meant the same as metropolitan. They were synonymous at that time. Archbishop and metropolitan meant the same thing. They would call them metropolitan, they'd call them archbishop, it meant the same thing at the time.
In a practical sense, they've kind of stayed synonymous because now you have metropolitans with episcopal rank and vice versa.
Although in the Russian tradition, you have people who are archbishops, but that's an honorific. They don't necessarily have metropolitan authority over other ruling bishops, though. But my point is that, so the English bishops, especially the Sainted Archbishop of Canterbury in the 780s, whose name I can't remember, was very much against it. He said this is not acceptable. Even though Pope St. Adrian said, look, I'm erecting this archbishopric in Lichfield. And what happened? Well, the Archbishop of York and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the other English bishops just said, we're not going to recognize it as an archbishopric. We don't care what the Legatine Synod has said. Because their view was that the Pope can't really destroy the canonical order of a local church. All right?
Yeah.
And what happened to the Archbishop of Lichfield? It just disappeared from history within 20 years. And it went back to being a regular bishopric.
Wow. Now, Atomic Lead has a question.
Okay.
And it says, speaking of hair shirts and freezing water, is self-flagellation as a penitential practice heterodox? I'm presuming he's talking about St. Francis of Assisi.
Well, you can find references to some of the Russian saints doing some self-flagellation. I would don't do this. If you're going to do something like that, go to an abbot of a monastery and ask him. Let's start before you even get into that kind of stuff. You need to have don't just jump into.
Don't do any practice without a spiritual father.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about prostrations that are dictated in the Typicon or the customary, that's different than doing like stuff of wearing.
I'm doing 1,000 prostrations on my own, because then what happens is it can lead to prelust and it can lead to loss of faith. It is important that it's harder to do things under obedience. If you are used to saying 1,000 Jesus prayers, I know people who, once they were put under obedience to a spiritual father, had trouble saying one, and that's the point. A person who gets to that level, like if you take someone like Saint Seraphim of Sarov, he spent 20 years on a rock. I mean, this is not something you can jump into. So when you're talking about Russian saints punishing themselves with hair shirts and things like that, or any of our old saints punishing themselves with hair shirts and stuff like that, they were operating under obedience. So don't take that risk.
In the few cases you can find them not having a spiritual father telling them and stuff, it was generally like an angel or saint. But even they had to confirm that through various spiritual practices that wasn't something like the demons trying to tell them to do that.
Exactly.
But even then, if it's an angel or God telling them, they're actually acting under obedience to God to do those things. But I think you can find some references in some of the very heavy ascetics to things like wearing almost like these belts under your shirt that had like kind of dulled edges to them, so it would be uncomfortable. They did do things like that. Yes.
Yeah. No. But even in the Book of Hours. That was put out by Jordanville. They used to say, when you lay down, instead of finding a pillow, find a rock and use that instead. Yes. The point is, but there's a difference between, and I do want to make this clarification, Vladika, because there is a difference between putting yourself through a level of privation and actually hitting yourself, which is what Francis of Assisi did, like, beating yourself with a whip. I haven't seen too many examples of that. It's possible it did occur with some Russian ascetics. I don't know if you could clarify that, Vladika. But
it's on my Facebook page. I posted it like a few months. I can't even look at my Facebook page now. I can't because of Chromium, and I can't.
Okay, let's see here. Ronald says, thank you for addressing my question, Father Joseph, and thank you, Your Holiness, for such a detailed answer.
What? Okay. I'm sorry, I beg your pardon?
I think he referred to you as your. Thank you. It's the easy. He's a diocesan. He's a vicar bishop, so it would be Your Grace.
Well, I've not turned in. I've not.
You're not patriarch yet. So
we've not transformed into conclavists. So.
Yeah. But thank you again. We appreciate it. That's why we do the show. I missed this one. EN7 says Palmarians also teach there's a Mary planet and a Satan planet. Oh. That's like Mormons, don't they? Everyone has a planet with the Mormons. Okay, and yes, and Atomic says yes. I was mainly thinking of whipping oneself. Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a crazy practice. And whatever practice you undertake, make sure it's under obedience, and it probably will not involve beating yourself. Let's see here. If are there any other questions? Because we're taking questions and comments. This episode has been dedicated to the book, The Pope and the Council. The link is at the beginning. I'll be putting it in the description box when we're done. Great, worthwhile reading for apologetics and answering Roman Catholics on infallibility, especially during the Pachamama, the time of the Pachamama, and all sorts of wonderful, times for Roman Catholics as they deal with the difficulties of being in their unworkable system. Ronald says, Your Grace, and what's it called? It says, I think Joseph the Hesychast would hit himself with a rod. Oh,
there is a famous Russian saint, and I cannot remember his name, and they still have kind of the whips he had and the metal belt and things like that. But my point is that those are extreme forms of asceticism, and you need to go through several levels. For example, Saint Benedict says that don't try to become the anchorite before you've even lived in a monastery.
Yeah.
If you read his role of Saint, now for example, Saint Benedict, when he became a monk, or when he wanted to seek out monasticism, there were a lot of people in Italy who were trying to do it. All right, and they were often his main monks, and they went off, and some of them failed spectacularly, and some of them succeeded spectacularly. But most people just simply didn't progress anywhere. And he found a monk called Saint Romanus, who was a hermit, who was able to give him some instruction. Because speaking of Celtic monks, there were Celtic monasteries there, but that people found out that their practices were so harsh and so extreme that I'm hearing echo for some reason.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Let me see if I can fix it.
They could not fulfill, the rigorous regime, and people would not be able to do it every day, and they'd end up giving up, and they'd end up leaving monasticism, and going off and get married or something like that, and putting them in a bad situation by just renouncing their vows. So.
Okay, sorry about that. I just want to make sure there was no echo. Definitely, it's again not something. I'm not a spiritual father. I'm just a deacon, and well, of
I'm just
Ladika's,
saying. All I'm saying. I'm not saying do it. I'm just saying I think there may be cases where there was something like that.
but they're extreme cases.
Yes, yeah. So don't go on saying, "Oh, Bishop Enoch said, people need to do that." I mean,
Bishop Enoch said, "Go get a whip." That's not what he said.
so I'm saying maybe you can find somebody who did that, but don't take that as an example. Okay.
Practice regular things like fasting and saying over,
Yeah.
doing the services.
Try to do the regular stuff first. Yeah.
Let's see. So let's see here. Are there any other questions or any comments? As I mentioned, we've we talked about the book, The Pope and the Council. This is going to be the last show of the season. Regular show. We may do another show sometime in between because we tend to always do. We did that last year. We took the break, but then we ended up doing a couple of shows anyway. And so that's what we're doing here. So if there are any other questions, now's the time to put them together so that we can answer them and see if there's anything else we can help with. Ladika, have you found anything interesting that you wanted to discuss over the past, I guess week or so in terms of there's always stuff happening?
Probably not. I don't know unless you have something in mind.
Well, no, I mean I don't. The Pachamama Synod was sitting in the back of my head. I was wondering about that, so someone brought that up. That's good. The Vatican seems to just be collapsing in on itself. I read there was they investigated. I think it was the Vatican Bank, and it turned out that there were all sorts of lurid accusations coming out about priests just using money Vatican priests, using money for apartments for parties and just all sorts of weirdness. It's just starting to rot over there, and it's an opportunity because again, a lot of the difficulty is psychology when you're dealing with papists. You can put history in front of them, but they are absolutely convinced that they have to be in union with the Pope. And, you have to keep that in mind, that some of these people are going to be hell or high water for him. He could proclaim Antichrist, and I think there'd still be a good number of them that would be like, yay, Antichrist. So the point is, you have to know who you're dealing with and work with people who aren't that ingrained, who haven't become that convinced, because it will help a lot in terms of bringing them out and back into the fold of the church. So it's a huge opportunity. We wrote. When did we write that letter to the traditionalist papists? Was that 7 years ago?
Must be. We should maybe do an update of it.
We should, because frankly, they could use it. Because that opportunity is there, and we have a chance to preach the truth. We're in an unprecedented era of having all of the data, and we want to make use of it. So again, we're here as a resource. If there are any questions. Of course, we still run the Orthodox Apologetics War Room and War Zone on Facebook, and we have the Orthodox Apologetics Discord. We have a presence on Twitter. So the point is, we're not. If you need us in the meantime, we're around. And if it's a big enough question or a big enough event, we could do a show on it. But until then, basically, I think what are we going to give it, another 10 minutes or so? You think, Nika?
Yeah. By the way, I typed in self-flagellation on Google Images. Most of this stuff, I'm pretty sure, is not what that one Russian ascetic was doing. They weren't cutting themselves, the flesh. Some of this is crazy stuff. Okay, really? So I typed it in Russian. So anyway, wow. Okay, let's give a few more minutes. Not much else is happening. So if there are no more questions, we can, I think, retire.
Okay, sounds like a plan. And then, here's another question. Atomic Lead asks, do you think a schism in the Roman Catholic Church is coming between the Francis Catholics and the traditionalists? I'll be honest.
If you read LifeSite News, it seems like it is.
Yeah, but I mean, I've noticed that every time they've had one of these, every time you heard some liberal thing coming out from somebody, what happens is all these traditional Catholic newspapers, like there used to be one, I don't know if it still exists, called The Wanderer. And now I think it's called The Remnant. But the point is that, like a site like LifeSite News is kind of following up in that vein, where they're like the traditionalist, what's the muckrakers? They're there writing the papers, trying to stop the heresy.
Okay,
And the truth is,
so I found I'm going to give you this link.
Mhm.
I'm going to post it in the StreamYard chat, and then you can post it in the regular chat.
okay,
So Saint Irenarch of Rostov, that's who I'm thinking of.
okay,
And I'm going to give you also another link so you can see the picture of I found a way to search my Facebook page without going to the page directly. And you can see the basically chains that Saint Irenarch would wear. And I don't know if you want to. So,
I'm putting those in the chat. I do want to see those, so I'm going to click them real quick. Because saints wearing chains, that's actually got a long history to it. I've heard that in almost every national church. Let me see here. Okay.
Now the problem is that the photo I have was listed. I believe this photo was from the Russian Wikipedia.
Okay.
And it said that this was his monastic hood, chains, and whips. However, on the life of Saint Irenarch, it says he, having withdrawn into solitude, Saint Irenarchus chained himself to a wooden chair, and he placed on himself heavy chains and crosses. For this, he endured the mockery and sneers of the brethren. So there's a lot of chains. The whips may simply be people reading too much into it. I don't really know. So,
yeah, I don't see any whips. I just see a lot of chains, and they seem to have crosses on them. I guess maybe that metal thing, but that could also be a yoke of some kind.
Yeah.
Well,
wearing chains underneath your clothes and on your skin, heavy chains that can themselves cause physical discomfort. That's pretty ascetic as it is. If you're doing
and that you don't even need to whip yourself. But again, don't put on chains without permission of your spiritual father, because most people aren't ready for that level. So let me see here what else we've got going on. So outside of that, I think if there's no other questions, I'm looking here, checking Facebook. Let me quickly check Discord, see if any questions popped up on there. And then after that, I think we can retire. Let's see here real quick. Okay, open. And I'm looking for any other questions.
I got a new book in the mail.
Oh, what'd you get?
It's the catechetical or creedal homilies of Saint Quadvoldeus. He was the metropolitan of Carthage, and he reposed in around 450. He was
he's one of the famous African saints who's like black. He's a black saint.
Yeah. Yes. He because if you look at the mosaic that's in Naples, he is black.
Yeah.
I don't know if its features aren't exactly like super sub-Saharan, but his skin is definitely black. I mean, so whatever you want to make, there was some sort of interaction there with sub-Saharan population.
People who do say like, oh, that's impossible. That they're
now, I don't know. I don't think Saint Augustine was not a black African. I know that, but Saint Quadvoldeus definitely was.
I'm still not. I mean, I'm 50-50 on this.
All the early mosaics Saint Augustine do not show him as a black man.
Well, what do they show him as?
He is shown as a Berber.
Okay,
and then I'm sorry. He's Punic in Latin. That's his heritage. The Punics were Semitic people. His mother was from that portion. They're like Phoenicians, and his father's side was Latin colonists and such. So I mean, he would have been a Mediterranean in his appearance.
Okay,
if you know what I mean. But Saint Quadvoldeus definitely was black. You can just look at the mosaics in Italy, and you can see that he was some sort of a black man. But anyway, the creedal homilies, I've been looking through. It's from the Ancient Christian Writer series. It's a very short book. Maybe.
How is it?
I've gotten through the first homily almost. It's very good. There's one portion of the homily where I suspect there's actually interpolation in them, and I think you
want to check the Latin?
No, yeah. Well, I checked the Latin in the Patrilogia, which doesn't really help a lot because they just print the latest text they had. But I'm pretty sure that Zernikoff actually points out a manuscript where there's a reference to the Filioque, like, oh, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. It kind of comes out of nowhere in the text.
Oh, so it's one of those.
I think Zernikoff points out that this actually isn't in the oldest manuscripts. Oh, so wow. Anyway.
But besides, obviously, that interpolation, it's a very good book. It's basically meant for catechumens who are preparing for baptism. Because, of course, the catechumen, according to the canons, is properly done over a series of... see, technically, people hear about catechumens being catechumens for 2, 3, or 4 years. But there was a stage in which you'd be, for example, like a hearer. There was another stage after being a hearer. You'd be like this other stage. But then at the beginning of Lent, you'd have to give your name. Do you want to be baptized for Holy Saturday?
Mm-hmm.
And then you would be formally given the catechumenate with, for example, the exorcisms and such. All right. And then you'd be baptized on Holy Saturday. So these homilies are basically for the week, I think, or a few days before the baptism, and maybe on Holy Saturday. So they're very good, I think. So, all right, I think we have no more questions, so we can retire.
All right, it sounds good. Thank you again to everyone for listening. Everyone who has who had questions, who had comments. We're always grateful. And again, we're taking a break. Wish all of you a joyous and productive Nativity fast. And
All right.
thank you very much. Benedicite.